Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we look at the classifieds murders of 1872. Who could believe that applying for a job in the classified section of your newspaper could see you end up murdered? This is just what happened to two men in 1872. The story begins. It was the 12th of March, 1872, and a man was rowing along the Parramatta River. It is believed that he was coming back from work to his home in Hunters Hill when he discovered a strange smell in the air. Upon nearing the Kissing Point area of the Parramatta River, he noticed something floating or bobbing up and down in the river, and the vile stench was getting stronger. It was a man's body. At once he contacted the police. The body was taken to Ryde Wharf. Senior Constable Samuels and the man had the nasty task of loading the body onto a cart. It was really heavy and bloated. They took the body to an outhouse in Ryde, where they went over the body to try and find any of the man's effects. Inside his jacket were naval discharge papers with the name John Bridger. Detectives Richard Elliott and William Camphon looked over the body, and they could see that there was an injury to the right temple. It was a gunshot wound. They determined that John Bridger had been shot before he hit the water. This suggested that he was cast into the Parramatta River by boat. Being such a heavy man, they determined it would have taken two people to do this. The body had had a 65-kilogram rock tied to it, but the killers didn't realise that the gases in the body would have inflated the body to the surface. Not even a 65-kilogram rock was going to stop this body from floating. Police had their victim, John Bridger, so they went about finding out who this man was and who knew him and why was he floating in the Parramatta River, murdered. They were able to ascertain from the papers inside his jacket that he'd been the steward on the HMS Rosario. Asking around in different places, and obviously the newspapers heard of this now, people started to come forward who knew John Bridger. He was a 26-year-old Englishman who had worked as a steward on the HMS Rosario the previous year. He was keen to start work on land now, as he'd finished up with the sea. He'd told many people he'd drank with at various hotels and pubs on the Circular Quay area. He'd even gone and had a portrait done at the photographic studio of Albert Chandler. He'd come forward as well and said the last time he'd seen John Bridger, there were two men with him, one with a moustache and one with a curly beard. This would be the last time John Bridger was seen alive. The police knew that they had to question the men that Albert Chandler had seen John Bridger with last. The same men in the pub also stated that they'd seen John Bridger drinking with two other men. A strange other little piece of information that the police were able to get from his drinking companions: he had obtained a job in a country store through the Sydney Morning Herald classifieds. The police at once contacted the Sydney Morning Herald. The name scribbled on the entry form of this advertisement read A.T. Norton. The clerk at the Sydney Morning Herald office thought he remembered the man who placed the ad. He was a youngish man with a heavy curly beard. This was the same description as what had been given from the photographer. Police knew of a couple of men who had just been released from Darlinghurst Jail that fit this description: a George Robert Nichols and an Alfred Lester. Another person that came forward after John Bridger's name had been put in the newspaper as being murdered was a Mrs. Stevenson, who ran a boarding house on 6 Bridge Street. She and her son Frederick remembered a man, a William Percy Walker, who had been staying with them, but who had also recently gone missing. They were worried something may have happened to him also. It was much too coincidental that another man had gone missing. The son of Mrs. Stevenson, Frederick Stevenson, was able to tell police that the last time that he saw Mr. William Percy Walker was the afternoon of the 12th, when he accompanied Mr. Walker to King Street Wharf, where he was meeting up with some men that were hiring him for a country store. Police began to grow very suspicious. They knew that William had met the same fate, and there was only one place that they could be sure to find him: the Parramatta River. They scoped the Parramatta River far and wide, and on the 19th of March, 15 days after the classifieds ad, they found a man's body drifting in Five Dock Bay. A stone even heavier than the one attached to Mr. Bridger was fastened around his neck. His legs were pointing out of the water because his head had been dragging him down, but his body wanted to float. Witnesses for both men told police that both men had luggage with them. John Bridger had his luggage with him at the pub when both men came to pick him up. This was taken by a barrowman to a public house where the men told John Bridger they couldn't fit his luggage on a boat and that they would pick it up at a later time. Frederick Stevenson had said the same thing, that when he accompanied Mr. Walker to King Street Wharf, that a man standing in a boat matching the description of one of the men told him that they could not take the luggage on the boat, that he would have to leave it at the hotel. Frederick Stevenson went with Mr. Walker and the two men into the hotel and watched as Mr. Walker's possessions were placed inside. They all had a drink together, and when it was time to leave, William went outside with Frederick. Mr. Walker thanked Frederick for all his help and shook his hand. Then he said something strange. He pulled out a large gold watch from his waistcoat and held it up and said, "You can swear I have this watch on me?" Frederick nodded, and that was the last time that Frederick saw Mr. Walker. The police looked at the room where Mr. Walker had boarded with Mrs. Stevenson. Among the items found in Mr. Walker's room was a reply from an Arthur Norton offering Walker the job. As well as going to the boarding house, police also went to the hotel that Frederick had said Mr. Walker's baggage had been left at. They went to the hotel and spoke to the people there, who claim only a short time after the baggage was left, a man matching Lester's description picked up the baggage and took it to a horse-drawn carriage outside. From there they did not know where the luggage went. The same would have been done with John Bridger's items. The police believed they were advertising these positions of employment in order to get these men on a boat and kill them, as well as taking their items of clothing and various other goods and selling them off, as they would have picked up John Bridger's items from the public house where they'd left them. They had to find out where these items were going, but they assumed it would be most likely an auction house. This was quite strange, as the history for George Nichols and Alfred Lester wasn't murder. Robert George Nichols was born in England in approximately 1838. His family migrated to Australia shortly after. He went to school at the Sydney College in Hyde Park and left at the age of 14 to go to sea. A year later, he came back to Sydney and was arrested for forging a note for £40. After this, he went back to sea and then served 12 months in prison in London for fraud. Upon his release, he came back to Sydney and got married, having 2 children. But he didn't stay out of trouble long. And as for the other suspect, Alfred Lester, he was born in Dorsetshire, England, in 1848 to a wealthy family. He left school at age 15 and was working as a telegraph clerk, but was caught embezzling funds. He fled to London and found his way to Sydney, where he got a job as a surveyor. He too ended up in Darlinghurst Jail with George Nichols for stealing from his boss. Now, in the Darlinghurst Jail, Nichols and Lester become quite good friends, and upon being released earlier in the year, they worked together at the Sydney Meat Preserving Company. But how did they jump from fraud to murder? Police contacted various auction houses in Sydney, including that of William Brisdale and John Proctor Lister, Brisdale and Lister's auction house on Pitt Street. They made contact with them. They arrested Nichols straight away and went to his home at Princess Street in the Rocks. Upon arriving at George Nichols' residence, they spoke to his wife, Mrs. Nichols, who had the support of her neighbours around her. Apparently, she knew nothing of what George was up to and was quite upset that he may be going back to jail, leaving her with the financial burden of the two kids. Before leaving the Nichols residence, the detectives took a small amount of rope from the clothesline. It was a strange thing for the detectives to do, but they had their reason. By now, the news of the two murders had reached almost everyone in Sydney and probably further out. Once they got their man George Nichols, they knew it had to be Alfred Lester from the description that the witnesses had given them. They tried a couple of places to try and locate him, but Alfred Lester's undoing came when he tried to pawn that watch of Mr. Walker's, the one he'd shown Frederick before he went missing. It had also been engraved with the initials WPW, William Percy Walker. It was at the pawnbroker in Haymarket, run by Mr. Isaac Moss. Apparently, Lester had taken the watch in to sell. Isaac, the owner, took it to the back room to his brother, Charlie. There was a couple of whispers exchanged, and Isaac told Alfred to come back in half an hour, and they'd give him an appraisal. They quickly phoned the police. Charles Moss told police the day before Mr. Walker went missing, he called in at the pawnbroker and showed him his gold watch. He told Charles Moss that if the watch had ever been offered to him by anyone, that he should hold on to it. And out of the 120 pawnbrokers operating in Sydney in 1872, this was the pawnbroker that Alfred Lester chose to sell Mr. Walker's watch. Detective Elliot wasted no time and arrived at the pawnbroker just in time to get in before Alfred came back. He questioned Lester, who became very nervous and who was wearing a shirt with the collar initialed WPW. They knew they had their man and they arrested Lester on the spot. They paid a visit to where Lester was living in Strawberry Hills. The landlady, a Mrs. Mary Blaker, let them in and took the detectives up the narrow stairs, describing the two men who told her that they'd just arrived in Sydney from Friendly Isles and taken a room at 7 shillings and 6pence a week. On the floor of the room, there were 3 boxes. They pulled out a shirt from one of the boxes and it had John Bridges' name on it. Various other items were pulled from the boxes, including a large weighty weapon known as a neddy or life preserver. This was covered in blood. They got as much information as they could for the trial. It was looking damning for the two men. There was an Isabella Buckley from Buckley's Boat Shed who was going to testify that the boat hired by Lester on the day in question was returned the following morning. There was blood in the boat. George Nichols had said that it was just fish blood, as they'd gone fishing in the boat. But the blood had been tested and had come back as mammal blood. What a strange circumstance. The trial began on Wednesday, May 20th in 1872. George Nichols and Alfred Lester stood trial at the Central Criminal Court in Darlinghurst. This would become a part of legal history in Australia. The Crown Prosecutor was the Attorney General Edward Butler and assisted by William Charles Windeyer. Lester was defended by a Sydney barrister named Grantley Fitzardange, assisted by Edmund Barton. Barton would become Australia's first Prime Minister on the last day of the year 1900. The men entered into a plea of not guilty, and the newspapers and the public had already found them guilty. Most newspapers were basically saying something similar to hang them. There was a mob outside the courthouse, and a lot of those people were screaming things to the effect of hang them, string them up. There were many witnesses at the trial. many that we've heard of already in this story. But there were a couple of others. A barrowman named Driscoll was shown a photograph of Mr. Bridger, and he almost fell over. He'd never seen a photo before, but he'd been the one to take the man's items from the pub to the outhouse on behalf of Lester and Nichols. There was also Albert Chandler, who'd taken the photo of Mr. Bridger and could point out the men easily. A Mary Redwell, a servant at the Royal Standard Hotel, was there when Bridger's baggage arrived, and then Lester and Nichols called to take it away. It ended up at Mrs. Howell's lodging house at 35 Crown Road in Millers Point, where Alfred Lester also was staying. Even young Frederick Stevenson took the stand. He was made to try and identify Walker's body after it had been decomposed, and he couldn't do it. The defence tried to pick his statement apart. Unfortunately, the bodies were pretty disfigured. Both men had been in the water for some time and didn't look like how they normally looked. It must have been awful for poor Frederick. But he could identify Nichols and Lester, as well as the cab driver who took them to the steamer wharf. He wasn't sure if it was Nichols, but he could identify Lester. And then we had a Mary Downey, a blonde barmaid who was at the Commercial Hotel on the corner of King and Sussex Street. She could remember Nichols, but couldn't remember Lester. So this was becoming a little bit of a problem. The defence lawyers could maybe cast a shadow of doubt if they couldn't identify both men. The defence did put up quite a bit of a fight, stating that innocent people had perished on the scaffold before because of circumstantial evidence and only been found innocent after they'd been hung, and it was foolish for anyone to have committed such a murder in a boat. It all came down to Judge Hargraves. The evidence, he said, was indeed circumstantial, but it wasn't overwhelming. However, the jury found both George Nichols and Alfred Lester guilty on both counts of murder. Alfred Lester began crying, and both men had to be supported by police as the death sentence was passed upon them. The newspapers reported how the jury had reached the correct verdict, and the prisoners were going to get what they deserved. In the days that followed the death sentence, both men wrote out confessions. They claimed the murders were carried out in the boat. Each victim was given brandy laced with poison to kill them off so that they could be thrown into the Parramatta River. However, on both accounts, the brandy didn't take them out and they had to be shot. Shooting them still didn't kill them, and Nichols had written that both men pleaded for their lives at the end. Now Lester started to point the finger at Nichols, stating that he was forced by Nichols into the whole thing. I'm sure that Lester could have stopped at any moment and left, but he still claimed that Nichols had blackmailed him into it somehow. On Tuesday, June the 18th, both men were going to be hung. They both had a hearty breakfast and were visited by clergymen who spent some time praying with them. At 9 a.m, spectators had gathered around to see them hung. They led Nichols and Lester to the scaffold. There must have been about 150 people watching in silence. Nichols stood tall and managed a smile, but Lester looked weak and very pale. They made penitent statements before shaking hands with the clergyman and each other, before the rope was put around their neck. The hangman and assistants fastened the ropes that were much like the ones they'd used to tie rocks around their victims' necks, which they learned in the trial matched the scrap they took from Nichols' clothesline. The white hoods were pulled down over their faces, and the hangman withdrew the bolt. The men dropped through the scaffold's trapdoor. Now at this point, it seems as though justice has prevailed. But like most of our videos, there's often a twist, and with this particular one, there seems to be many. Certain aspects that don't seem to line up. And a man named Lester Cotton, 90 years later, he even publishes a book named the Sydney Assassins, a mid-Victorian mystery, would reopen this case based on evidence he thought was dismissed. Let's look at that evidence, or theories. Now, the first bit of information that Cotton looks into is the fact that they wouldn't have made much money out of this. Once they had to pay baggage handlers, horse-drawn carts, many hotel rooms or boarding lodges, as well as the boat hire, the brandy and rounds of drinks at pubs they took the victims to, it all sounds like it would have cost them a lot of money for just a bit of money that they could find from selling some of their items. And then there was the fact that the murderers never hid themselves. They may have changed their names in newspaper and on documents, but everybody saw their face, and they were already known to police. John Bridger and William Walker weren't the only two men to apply for the ad. It seems there were two other men that were knocked back. It was thought that they were knocked back because they weren't as wealthy as John Bridger and William Walker, but it may be that John Bridger and William Walker were part of a conspiracy. When Lester Cotton looked into the individual men and their backstory, he found it all a bit curious. A couple of days before John Bridger vanished, the Sydney Morning Herald placed an ad for the HMS Rosario, and it read, "The officers of the HMS Rosario hereby give notice they will not be responsible for any debts contracted by John Bridger, their steward. Signed, T. Sanders, Lieutenant HMS Rosario." It gave Cotton the idea that perhaps John Bridger had been billing the Rosario for various things he did on land, and the lieutenant didn't want any debts mounting up for the Rosario. And as for William Percy Walker, he had that gold watch, which was apparently given to him by a grateful Victorian church congregation when he left Victoria for New South Wales. He did resign from the congregation, but it was after unnatural offence charges had been laid against him from two schoolboys. The Maryborough Advertiser had details of some kind of charge in the newspaper down there, but due to lack of evidence, he was found not guilty. What had William Walker got himself into back in Victoria? Possibly something that made him flee to New South Wales. Cotton found this quite strange, as well as the fact that both bodies had been in the water so long that they were unrecognisable, as well as the fact that William Walker was missing his moustache, and that he was a short man, around about 160 centimetres, but the corpse was measured at 170 centimetres. Now, Cotton states that bloating does affect the body, but not stretch it, and they were dressed in their own clothing. The discharge papers from the HMS Rosario were conveniently placed in John Bridger's pockets. Would the killers not have thought to empty the pockets of what they had, just in case it may have, identified them? And then there was a thought that maybe, the killers didn't think the bodies would come to the surface. But these men were educated, weren't they? Very strange indeed. Lester Cotton also brings up a story that was happening at the time. There was a Roger Tichborne, an heir to the Tichborne family back in England, and apparently quite a bit of wealth, who had apparently become shipwrecked and lost at sea in 1854. Lady Tichborne, the mother of the lost son Roger, put an advert out in the newspapers saying that her son had been missing for some time and was feared lost at sea. A man by the name of Arthur Orton from Australia, from Wagga, a simple butcher, replies to this ad and gains support in Australia, enough to raise money to go to England and claim to be the heir Roger Tichborne. At first, Lady Tichborne accepts him, but there's a lot of controversy around it. After Lady Tichborne passes away, there's a trial. The other Tichborne family members believe this Arthur Orton is a fraud, and another man, a William Cresswell, who's in Gladesville Asylum back in Sydney, is claiming Arthur Orton isn't the son of Lady Tichborne, but that he is. And then a strange occurrence happens where two men closely associated with this William Crestwell in the asylum, an attendant at the asylum, and another patient from Parramatta Jail go missing. Two men at the same time as these murders go missing. And Cotton has a theory that perhaps the bloated bodies in the Parramatta River may have been those men, and that perhaps John Bridger and Mr. William Percy Walker may have lived under different names the rest of their days. It's very, very strange and interesting as we like to dig up these stories, but this wasn't the last thing that was strange about the whole thing. A man named Edward Popel, the undertaker for Darlinghurst Jail, was given the bodies after their hanging to bury. This Mr. Edward Popel also was a mine host at the Morning Star Hotel Waterloo, and he saw a financial opportunity. Now, instead of burying these bodies straight away, he placed the coffins in the parlour of the hotel. The lids were left open and patrons were invited to view these felons for the last time at sixpence a view. The hotel started doing a roaring trade, but then the police found out about it. Popel received a reprimand and lost his contract with the Darlinghurst Jail. How odd. After this whole case has gone on, and then this guy shows a viewing of Nichols and Lester after they've been hung, and people paid to see it. People are strange. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed looking into it. But don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more strange videos.